I'm going to speak to you about some larger scale issues this morning that pertain to both the possibilities that the pandemic has opened up for philosophical practice, which are considerable and are just underway as we have made this reset to a new kind of normalcy. But there are also some problems inevitably that are associated with these developments. And I want to get you as philosophers to think more carefully about some of the problems and how, in addressing these problems, we can actually serve the mission broadly construed of philosophical practice. So I'm going to read a paper to you, and with the help of Vikash, will be no, you're not supposed to share this. No, please, no. I'm asking you to share the PDF slides, not the text. But don't start the slides yet. Obviously, we haven't rehearsed. Yes, but stop this now, okay? That's the title page, and please stop the share. And I will tell you when to start the share, and the share will begin on the first slide after the page. Okay, so we'll try to coordinate this on the fly, and please bear with us as we coordinate the images and the text. All right, so here is the talk, and obviously there should be some time for our interaction afterwards. As we enter our third year of COVID-19, we are able to reflect on its emergent transformations of the global village, for better and worse, and to inquire as to how these transformations are affecting the growth and evolution of philosophical practice. No matter which dimension of the pandemic's effects we explore, be it medical, psychological, educational, socioeconomic, or political, we immediately perceive that applied philosophy has enhanced relevance, whether in descriptive, interpretative, or indeed prescriptive roles. This talk will focus on an overarching technological feature of the pandemic's effects, which has operated and continues to operate significantly in all the foregoing dimensions. That feature is the virtualization of all possible formerly real human transactions and interactions, in tandem with the intensification of virtual transactions and interactions previously in place. Even prior to the pandemic, the digital revolution had been transforming human self-conception and human interaction in unprecedented ways, not all of them salutary or conducive to well-being. For example, the malign effects of social media on young people particularly, and the brazen censorship of nonconformist or dissident views by tech oligarchs were already being noted and protested by free thinkers, public intellectuals, consumer advocates, and assorted pundits, including yours truly. These and kindred issues have taken a temporary back seat to the exigencies of the pandemic, which at the same time has fostered their ongoing exacerbation. Operationally, it amounts to this. The pandemic has displaced a significant proportion of formerly real human interactions and transactions, real meaning embodied beings inhabiting physical spaces in synchronous times, to virtual human interactions and transactions, virtual meaning disembodied beings inhabiting digital spaces at desynchronous or indeed asynchronous times. Said a different way, the vital forces that had formerly animated and infused real human interactions and transactions, forces such as physical presence, personal gravitas, emotional palpability, sensory impression, pheromonic reception, body language, and social engagement, have all been sublimated into virtual versions that pale beside the real. Descartes' cogito, itself an irreconcilable divorce of mind from body, has been further impoverished to pipo ergo sum, I tweet, therefore I am. Please share the first slide, Vikash, if you would. Yes, pipo ergo sum, and this is from the Latin pipare, meaning how small birds tweet in the trees. Yes, pipare, to tweet in the trees like a small bird. So pipo ergo sum is the current human condition as far as virtuality is concerned. There is a name for this region into which humanity has been summarily displaced, and it was coined exactly 1 century ago, in 1922, by the prescient French Jesuit and scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Next slide, please, Vikas. Chardin called it the noosphere and defined it as the thinking envelope of Earth. For Chardin, the noosphere has theological and teleological implications. His Russian friend, scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, developed his own interpretation of the noosphere. Next slide, please. Which he reconceived in a less mystical and more scientific light. Vernadsky's father was an economist to the imperial court, and his mother was a music teacher. He had a very interesting life. But in any case, he met Chardin in Paris and developed a parallel interpretation of the noosphere. The noosphere supervenes on the Earth's biosphere. Please, next slide. The noosphere supervenes on the Earth's biosphere, which itself supervenes on the geosphere. Simply stated, the geosphere is a bedrock whose constitutive elements and fortuitous solar orbit, the so-called Goldilocks zone, were conducive to the emergence of the biosphere. The biosphere is a region overlapping habitable parcels of the geosphere's land, sea, and air, in which myriad life forms have evolved amidst alternating proliferations and mass extinctions. The noosphere is a medium of shared consciousness that emerged from the rational consciousness of the most conspicuous of these terrestrial life forms, namely ourselves. Next slide, please. So the geosphere, again, is shaped by physical forces. The biosphere is shaped by vital forces and natural selection, and the noosphere is shaped by noetic forces and synthetic selection, which is an analogous form of evolution that pertains to culture, exclusive of biology. I can say more about that later, but I will not focus on that today. So before pursuing our analysis of the geosphere, or the noosphere, and the emerging role of philosophical practice within it, we would do well to ponder the vastly different timescales on which these three spheres are configured. The geosphere and its solar systemic neighborhood required billions of years to evolve to the point where they could support a viable biosphere. While the oldest sentient beings and their descendants, e.g. sharks and rays, have endured for a few 100 million years, the primates are only tens of millions of years old, Homo sapiens only 200,000 or so years. The noosphere itself was christened or defined only a century ago, and it required the digital revolution some decades later to begin to populate it. Since then, its expansion and population have grown exponentially and have yet to attain their limiting potentials. Next slide, please. Okay, the one after that. We'll come back to the FANG in a moment. Yes, this one. So you can see the proliferation of data in the noosphere from this graphic, and please understand that the vertical timescale is logarithmic. It's nonlinear. Each increment on the vertical timescale is 10 times its previous increment. So this is an absolutely incredible explosion of data, and it's in fact the sum total of human shared consciousness. So consider that the first email was sent by Roy Tomlinson in 1971, and by 2020 more than 300 billion emails per day were being sent, amounting to more than 1 trillion emails that year. Consider that the first website was launched in 1991, and that by 2021 there were 1.88 billion websites in existence, plus or minus, because they also, emerge and become extinct in their turn, some of them. Similarly, the size, scope, and scale of operations of the so-called FANG, the tech tyrannosaurs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, are all increasing exponentially. In December 2019, there were 10 million participants per day worldwide in Zoom meetings. Yeah, this is the FANG, and we'll say more about them later. They are devouring smaller enterprises as we speak, and also, as we will see, curating the data that they permit to be exchanged on their platforms. And this is a very serious problem to which I will return. In December 2021, there were 300 million Zoom participants per day. This represents, in 2 years of the pandemic, an astronomical increase of 2,900%. The average American is now spending 5 to 6 hours per day on a mobile device, running apps that interface with all the foregoing platforms, among countless others. So one net effect of the pandemic has been to further exponentiate the growth of all these digital technologies, which have in very short order fundamentally and in some cases irreversibly altered the ways in which humans interact, both with themselves and with others. In a most fundamental sense, the virtualization of a slate of formerly real-life and real-time human interactions amounts to the teleportation of human consciousness and its shared expression out of the geosphere, i.e. beyond the body, and out of the biosphere, i.e. beyond the embodied social matrix, and lock, stock, and barrel into the noosphere. This thinking envelope of Earth is a medium that transmits, receives, reflects, filters, curates, minds, tracks, exploits, and algorithmizes digitized emanations of disembodied and desocialized consciousnesses themselves. The rapidity of the noosphere's evolution and the transformation of consciousness is occasioning and also driving. These are things are unprecedented in our species. If Homo sapiens is of the order of 200,000 years of age, then all but the last 9,000 years or so of human cultural evolution were based on oral traditions. These were remarkably stable, if technologically non-innovative traditions. Could you please show the next slide? This is the oral tradition, and it's the oldest of the 4 cultural traditions that we can trace in the evolution of humanity outside of biology. So the oral tradition was remarkably stable, and it still is. But it was superseded, of course, by the written tradition. And if you could show the next slide, please. The oral tradition was stable, but technologically largely non-innovative. It was suddenly superseded by the prodigious written tradition and its incessant innovations, eventually including the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The written tradition, in turn, was largely superseded by the visual tradition. Next slide, please. Yes, the visual is compassed by the invention of movies initially, but television predominantly. Prior to television, families used to gather around the radio, listening to their favorite broadcasts. But following the mass production of television in the 1950s and the proliferation of channels and programs, TV supplanted radio as the technological focal point of family gatherings. Note that television did not render radio extinct. The oral tradition still survives in the shadow of the visual, but in diminished capacity. Lately, it is making a comeback via audiobooks. Neither did the visual tradition render the written tradition extinct. Book and magazine publishing industries continued to flourish for a while alongside television and radio. Listeners to radio or viewers of TV could find themselves interrupted by an encyclopedia salesman knocking at their door. Next slide, please. Yes, that one. How many of you owned encyclopedias? I did. My parents bought me one set because they thought it would be good for our educational opportunities at home. And we used to have people knocking on our door selling such things. I did this one summer myself as a summer job, trying to sell encyclopedias door to door. It was very harrowing and not very lucrative, but nonetheless there was an industry of this for a time. This was where you could get your encyclopedias at home. So basically, the latest this average time spent watching television. Back up one slide, please. The average time watching television, back up one slide, please, swiftly eclipsed the average time spent listening to radio and reading books. So the visual tradition born in the 1950s superseded both of its predecessors. That is the 200,000-year-old oral tradition and the 9,000-year-old written one. But the latest innovation of the written tradition, advance 2 slides, please. One more, yeah. One may date its inception to the introduction of the IBM personal computer in 1981, spawned the digital revolution. And the evolution of the digital revolution shapes the noosphere's structures and functions as the container of the shared consciousness of humanity. In an oral tradition, people spent hours each day listening or telling stories. In a written tradition, people spent hours each day reading and writing. In a visual tradition, people spent hours each day watching television or movies. In a digital tradition, people spend hours each day doing all the above things but online. In addition to emailing, tweeting, gaming, shopping, scamming, gambling, investing, teaching, learning, Zooming, live streaming, and whatever else they are virtualizing today that will go virtually viral tomorrow. Indeed, if you were an alien anthropologist from another planet studying the Earth from orbital space, intercepting and measuring its many and varied electromagnetic emanations across the broadest possible spectrum, you could not fail to notice the ever-increasing volume of satellite-mediated broadband transmissions, which constitute the very fabric of the noosphere. Yet you would also notice that the patterns within these transmissions are the antithesis of randomness. They carry meaningful strings of ones and zeros that represent the variegated messages within the medium. The attractive, if not hypnotic, and addictive power of the digital tradition stems from its seamless incorporation of oral, written, and visual traditions combined. Thus, the noosphere untethers both producers and consumers of culture from spatial and temporal constraints. If you are interested in a deeper analysis of these 4 modes of human cultural evolution and how they affect our cognition as a species, then I would suggest that you read The Middle Way, 2nd edition, 2020. Next slide, please. This book contains, among other things, a report card that compares and contrasts these 4 traditions. Next slide, please. In terms of their effects on 4 pillars of human cognition: attention span, linguistic ability, imaginative capacity, and cultural memory. And as you can see from this chart, which is taken from Chapter 10 of The Middle Way, the digital tradition in particular can cut both ways. It can either enhance or impoverish cognition depending on how it is utilized. In any case, it exacts some peculiar and not altogether salutary transaction costs on those who engage with it. Since the pandemic has compelled so many to spend so much time in the noosphere, including us today, it has also magnified and amplified these costs. To understand them better, consider this. Okay, could you please stop the share for now, and we'll pick it up again in a short while. Thank you very much. So consider this. Data transmitted and received in the noosphere are thus far constrained to be represented either as images, sounds, or text, or as animations embodying images, sounds, or texts. Thus, these data impinge on only 3 of our 6 human senses. Images stimulate the visual cortex, sounds the auditory cortex, texts the noetic cortex, or if you prefer, mentation, or our sense of thought itself. But at the same time, our other 3 senses, gustation, or sense of taste, olfaction, sense of smell, and tactition, sense of touch, are deactivated in the noosphere, as are pheromonic transmitters and receptors as well. Thus, and this is extremely important, thus perceptual consciousness in the noosphere is necessarily attenuated, robbed of 3 senses that are continuously deployed in the geosphere and biosphere for purposes including socialization, acculturation, and humanization, not to mention the role of pheromones. This impoverishment of human sensory experience in the noosphere may have lasting effects on consciousness itself, and ultimately on what it means to be human. Imagine sitting around a table or a hearth with family or friends sharing a meal. I mean, particularly aromatic Indian food, for example. This has been a definitive human activity since the earliest days of our species' existence. All 6 senses are fully engaged. Now imagine a Zoom meeting with family or friends or colleagues sharing a virtual meal. There is no possibility of any shared experience of taste, touch, or smell, nor of any second-order effects on consciousness itself of a shared experience of taste, touch, or smell. So if we now inquire as to why online education for K-12 school children is proving to be such a disaster, at least in the United States it is, and I'm assuming in other countries as well, we find a significant thread of explanation in this foregoing example. For children and adolescents to develop and flourish in wholesome social and cognitive pathways, they require a full range of real spatial and real temporal interactions that engage all 6 senses, and not an attenuated range of virtual interactions that engage only 3 senses. Online education of children, and indeed online activities of adults as well, necessarily entails what amounts to sensory deprivation. Such deprivation, in turn, impedes socialization and impairs cognition. But this is only the tip of the virtual iceberg, for the noosphere is not simply a passive medium in which perceptual consciousness and its fruits are shared. The noosphere is an active and sometimes hyperactive medium that is both utilized visibly and manipulated invisibly to engage and reshape conceptual consciousness itself, not only for social, educational, and entertainment purposes, but also, if not overarchingly, for commercial, ideological, and political ones, whether benign or malign. In all cases, the noosphere represents a vast new arena of contending competitive forces that seek to lure and captivate minds for as many minutes and hours as possible, and in the worst cases, to habituate, indoctrinate, and ultimately enslave them. The noosphere has fomented a cybernetic gold rush, a virtual Wild West. Its prospectors and pioneers, carpetbaggers and robber barons are all competing for timeshares in everyone's consciousness. There is nothing that human beings are capable of thinking, saying, or doing in reality that has not by now been cloned in virtuality. This was an aspiration during the formative years in the noosphere to virtualize material things. But having successfully virtualized real things, the Dei ex machina behind the smoke and mirrors of cyberspace have unfortunately discovered that this process is fully reversible. They are now successfully materializing virtual things. At a personal level, data mining and targeted marketing are tracking individual consumers in regards to their browsing and online shopping habits, tailoring and personalizing the incessant advertisements that plague websites unless one pays with time or money to bypass or remove them. But these are merely minor annoyances or distractions, akin to too many billboards cluttering an otherwise scenic highway. At a cognitive level, manipulations and distortions of data, and therefore also of consciousness, are rampant. Empirically, it is well established that consumers willingly visit and revisit virtual domains that reinforce their entrenched prejudices. This is a wholly different matter than listening repeatedly to one's favorite music or regularly eating one's favorite foodstuffs. Why? Is expected, if not celebrated, in any open society. But the curating, filtering, shadow banning, and downright deplatforming of nonconformist or dissident views is the very antithesis of diversity in an open society. Rather, it is a brazen epistemic tyranny that herds consumers into the depths of a virtualized Plato's cave. The epistemic tyrants who attempt to control truth in the noosphere are therefore unwittingly creating opportunity for philosophical practitioners to emulate the Socratic tradition, to re-enter the virtual cave and help liberate its captives. We do not claim to be possessors of truths, but rather to be comparatively dispassionate inquirers who, via the time-honored Elenchic method, strive at least to expose transparent absurdities and dispel patent falsehoods. In this role, philosophers have more work to do than ever. Could you resume the share, please, with the next slide? Next one. Thank you. Recall Bertrand Russell's amusing yet chilling pamphlet on the power of propaganda, written in 1943, when radio and newspapers were still the leading technologies in the fabrication of news and the manipulation of public opinion. Give me an adequate army, Russell wrote, with power to provide it with more pay and better food than falls the lot of the average man, and I will undertake within 30 years to make the majority of the population believe that 2 and 2 are 3, that water freezes when it gets hot and boils when it gets cold, or any other nonsense that might seem to serve the interest of the state. Nota bene, no person who did not enthusiastically accept the official doctrine would be allowed to teach or to have any position of power. This, of course, anticipates the cancel culture, which is rampant now and is being manipulated by the tech oligarchs, those tyrannosaurs of the FANG. Only the very highest officials in their cups would whisper to each other what rubbish it all is, and they would laugh and drink, and again, this is hardly a caricature of what happens under some modern governments. I submit to you that, exacerbated by the pandemic and abetted by the relentless conversion of the noosphere into a virtualized Plato's cave, Russell's warning is hardly a caricature at all, for this is happening under most, if not all, current governments, except that some of the very highest officials appear to believe their own rubbish as fervently as the indoctrinated prisoners in their virtual cave. Please pause the share again. Thank you. I am sure you can see how epistemic tyranny is itself a lever of political tyranny. Many of you surely realize that the pandemic has, within 2 short years, become a pretext for governments of the formerly freest nations on earth to strip their citizens of supposedly inalienable civil rights, to rule by perpetual decree in defiance of their own constitutions, and to politicize medical science to justify such rule. They are utilizing the noosphere for tracking, tracing, enabling, or disabling human transactions and interactions, not because it conduces to arresting the pandemic, but because it centralizes political power and cows, if not terrorizes, citizens into compliance. After 9/11, and the subsequent spate of Islamic terror attacks across Europe, as well as in Mumbai, a widely repeated mantra declared, "We are all Israelis now." After only 2 years of COVID-19, it is equivalently clear that we are all mainland Chinese now. When it comes to mandating control of their own citizens, governments of the Anglophone nations, America, Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, are behaving like cadet branches of the Chinese Central Party Committee in terms of authoritarian control. Police statehood aside, the unwholesome effects of the pandemic do not confine themselves to untimely deaths of loved ones and unexplained cases of long COVID. Non-medical side effects include psychological and socioeconomic debilitations of lockdowns, marked increases in alcohol abuse, drug abuse, domestic violence, and teenage suicide. There are widespread feelings of powerlessness, despair, or anger among the general populace. There are fears engendered by calculated media hysteria. While many citizens are becoming fed up with authoritarian demands of unquestioned obedience to whichever dictate du jour best serves the interests of the ruling elites, yet many remain fearful of speaking out in an increasingly politicized and punitive culture. The elites in turn exempt themselves from the very decrees they promulgate. All these problems that the pandemic has spawned spanning every sector of society, cry out for the voices of philosophical practitioners to be heard. We must amplify the extent of our presence in the noosphere, offering counsel and facilitating discussion on all these issues in ways and from perspectives that we have been uniquely trained to provide. How each of you rises to this challenge is entirely up to you, but the movement of philosophical practice itself must move into and throughout the noosphere to keep pace with the twin developments of the digital tradition itself and its intensification by the pandemic. It is necessary and also enriching for communities of philosophical practitioners to meet in the noosphere, as we are doing here, but it is not sufficient for the continued growth of the movement. We must make our philosophical services as available in the noosphere as they were in the biosphere and geosphere, for that is where human consciousness is spending ever more of its time and ever more of its resources. Beyond this, some of you may choose to deploy yourselves as virtual public intellectuals and indeed as virtual Socratic gadflies, stinging the noospherical horses of state by posing potentially upsetting questions. For instance, here's just a quick example, and it's not a political example, it's an epistemic one. As to accumulated knowledge, Encyclopedia Britannica has morphed into Wikipedia. But how much of Wiki is true, and how much is false? Has contingent or synthetic truth become a matter of algorithmically curated noospherical consensus? Isn't that a potentially dangerous metric? But if such truths have a more robust virtual touchstone, of which noetic elements are they forged? We know that the noosphere is a product of rational consciousness, for we know its history from credible independent accounts in the oral, written, and visual traditions, now folded digitally into the noosphere itself. But if the noosphere were to become a full-blown epistemic tyranny, then this thinking of envelope of Earth, a second-order product of rational consciousness meant to house a virtual record of the entire first-order output of rational consciousness, would be commandeered by a cartel of ruling elites who predetermine its contents, thus exercising censorship over rational consciousness itself. That would constitute an ironic injustice, beside which mere book burnings would pale. In the Anglophone precincts of the noosphere, and undoubtedly among those of other language groups as well, mindless apparatchiks trumpet Orwellian slogans like diversity, by which they mean unquestioned acceptance of a monolithic political narrative as the sole permissible and incontrovertibly true account of the world's problems. This will not stand unopposed by free-thinking philosophers, for we possess one meta-truth that cannot be censored by fiat, namely that nobody governs truth itself. This happens to be the motto of the APPA, founded back in 1999. Nemo veritatem regit, in Latin, nobody governs truth. Not Wikipedia, not the FANG, and most assuredly not woke mobs and their propagandists and apologists. The pandemic and its accompanying intensification of authoritarian control of the noosphere can be interpreted in a variety of ways. We have already had recourse to the allegory of Plato's cave, which is obviously compelling. Perhaps one day, if and when the truth about the origins of COVID-19 come to light, we will be able to narrow the field of contending hypotheses. Meanwhile, the spectrum of our oral and written traditions provide ample food for interpretative thought about the current state of the world. Would you please resume the share, Vikash, and go to the next slide? I'm coming to the conclusion, in case you're worried that this goes on forever. Our Indian friends can certainly remind us that we're inhabiting nothing more or less than Kali Yuga, and that certainly provides a lot of explanatory power. Our Greek friends could remind us of the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. Our British friends can certainly remind us of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, a laboratory monster who turns on his mad scientist creator. Shelley's tale seems particularly apt, for COVID-19 makes potential Frankensteins of us all, Yes, once you're infected, you can then infect others, so we all become Frankenstein under that interpretation. Yet the origins of Frankenstein predate Mary Shelley. They lie in the Kabbalistic lore of the golem. Next slide, please. A man-made creature formed from clay. In some accounts, a golem is brought to life by inscribing on its forehead the Hebrew word emet, meaning truth. The golem then becomes responsive to its master's commands until it becomes sufficiently self-aware to disobey them. This is the Kabbalistic prototype of Frankenstein. But the golem can be deactivated by the expedient of erasing the first letter of emet, the letter aleph, from its brow. We read from right to left in Hebrew. Thus, the remaining word met, meaning dead, is what causes the creature to revert to its inanimate state. Thus, the golem allegorizes those who quest after the one true vaccine that will decisively deactivate the virus. But the origins of golem are itself much older than the Kabbalah. For the first golem is none other than Adam in the Garden of Eden, the very first man whom God fashioned out of clay and animated with the breath of life. Adam and Eve likewise disobeyed their master's commands and ate of the fruit of the forbidden tree, not the tree of knowledge per se, but rather knowledge of good and evil. Our subsequent expulsion from Eden is a tale retold in every generation, and no more poignantly than during this time of COVID, when so many have been expelled from the geosphere and biosphere and into the noosphere. Since a man-made plague has herded us into the noosphere, I will conclude by quoting J.B.S. Haldane, a British Indian biologist, geneticist, and philosopher. Next slide, please. And last slide. Haldane portrayed the appearance of Nova Aquilae in 1918, as witnessed by 3 Europeans in India looking at a great new star in the Milky Way. These were apparently all of the guests at a large dance who were interested in such matters. Amongst those who were at all competent to form views as to the origin of this cosmoclastic explosion, a most popular theory attributed it to a collision between 2 stars, or a star and a nebula. There seem, however, to be at least 2 possible alternatives to this hypothesis. Perhaps it was the last judgment of some inhabited world, perhaps a too successful experiment in induced radioactivity on the part of some dwellers there. And perhaps these 2 hypotheses are identical, and what we were watching that evening was the detonation of a world on which too many men came out to look at the stars when they should have been dancing. While our species has indeed become capable of wreaking nuclear havoc on our own geosphere, as well as toxic havoc on our biosphere, gain-of-function viruses like COVID-19 confine their damage to the very species that created them, claiming its victims with a whimper instead of a bang. Perhaps Haldane would change his tune today, since what we are watching is the implosion of a socio-economic world order in which too many scientists stayed indoors tampering with genetic codes, while too many technocrats likewise remain indoors manipulating algorithms when they too should have been dancing. But now that dancing has been displaced into the noosphere, it is no longer a physical and social activity. Rather, the noosphere is a dance hall of ideas, whether in or out of step with the divine music of even-tempered consciousness. Philosophical practice seems particularly well suited to this kind of dancing, so I hope that you are eager to strut your stuff while the band plays on. The hall is thronged with displaced and desynced people, whose philosophical dance cards are more empty than full. Thank you very much for your kindness, and I hope this was thought-provoking for you.